All right, good morning, everyone. I'm Hoda Hidari. I am the KNL Gates Career Development Assistant Professor in Ethics and Computational Technologies here at Carnegie Mellon. And I would like to start off by thanking you all for being here and for taking part in the important discussion we are going to have about red teaming guidelines for generative AI. I would like to also start by acknowledging the sponsors of this event, the KNL Gates Endowment for Ethics and Computational Technologies and the Block Center for Technology and Society at Carnegie Mellon University. So if you're participating in this convening, you're likely aware that in response to rising concerns surrounding the safety, security, and trustworthiness of generative AI models, practitioners and regulators alike have pointed to AI red teaming as a key strategy for identifying and mitigating societal risks of these models. Notably, President Biden recently signed the executive order on the safe, secure, and trustworthy development and use of artificial intelligence, which mentions red teaming 8 times in total, mainly in the context of developing guidelines, standards, and best practices for AI safety and security. It mandates the Secretary of Commerce, acting through the Director of the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, to establish guidelines, best practices, and industry standards for evaluating and auditing AI capabilities, especially those that could cause harm, such as in the areas of cybersecurity and biosecurity. In particular, it requires guidelines, procedures, and processes to enable the developers of AI, especially of dual-use foundation models, to conduct AI red teaming tests to enable the development of safe, secure, and trustworthy systems. However, despite AI red teaming's central role in recent policy discussions and corporate messaging, significant questions remain about what precisely it means, how it relates to conventional red teaming practices in cybersecurity, as Elham mentioned, how it should be conducted, and what role it can play in the future evaluation and regulation of generative AI. So my goal with this brief presentation is to offer a common ground understanding of red teaming as a methodology for detecting the risks and harms of generative AI models and frame the upcoming panel discussions we will have throughout today's event. So in the first part, I will present some background material, including a brief history of red teaming. We then provide a broad overview of several recent AI red teaming exercises that have been conducted by the industry, as well as an overview of recent research advances, developing methodologies and case studies for red teaming and adjacent evaluation methods. We will observe that there is a lack of consensus around the scope, structure, and assessment criteria for AI red teaming. Now, based on our recent analysis of publicly available reports on AI red teaming exercises in industry, recent research contributions, and the comments submitted to NIST through the RFI that Elham mentioned, we have compiled a structured question bank meant to guide and scaffold future AI red teaming practices. And in part 2 of this presentation, I will review these criteria quickly, breaking them into considerations before, during, and after red teaming. And I will wrap up with an overview of the event today, its goals and outcomes. The goal, as the name suggests, is to support NIST's development of guidelines for AI red teaming. So I should mention that the presentation I'm giving is in large part based on the amazing intellectual work of 3 stellar doctoral students here at Carnegie Mellon, Michael Pfeffer, Anusha Sinha, and Wesley Deng. All 3 of them are in the audience today, and they're helping us out with the event organization. Please say hi and kudos to them if you meet them. Okay, without further ado, let's get started with a quick background. So according to Zenko and Abbas, the concept of red teaming originated hundreds of years ago in the context of warfare. In more recent history and as early as 1960s, the US military has used the term red team in reference to models of the Soviet Union behavior, in contrast to blue team, which was meant to refer to the US. As a methodology in cybersecurity, red teaming aims to assess an organization's security by simulating cyber attacks designed to identify vulnerabilities and security holes in the system. This helps determine what needs to be improved to defend the organization against real-life cyber threats, which is the job of the so-called blue teams. At a very high level, cybersecurity red teaming consists of 5 stages, including goal mapping, target reconnaissance, exploiting vulnerability, which is the main activity conducted by red teaming, then probing and escalation of the vulnerabilities detected, and reporting and analysis. So importantly, in red teaming on computer security involves modeling an adversary and mapping out the space of vulnerabilities from a specific threat lens. And this idea of clarifying what is the threat model is something that we are going to keep coming back to throughout this event. This is in contrast with other evaluation methods such as field testing and auditing, which are not adversarial in nature. And actually, in our overview, in our analysis of the comments submitted to NIST on red teaming, we observed that many organizations with the tradition of cybersecurity red teaming have called on NIST to develop its AI red teaming guidelines based on cybersecurity practices, including the creation of an AI vulnerability disclosure center and a comprehensive incident response plan for generative AI. So in our analysis of comments submitted to NIST on red teaming, we came across multiple proposed definitions. But for the purposes of this event, I'm going to propose that we rely on the definition offered by the Presidential Executive Order, which defines AI red teaming as a structured testing effort to find flaws and vulnerabilities in an AI system, often in a controlled system and in collaboration with developers of AI. The executive order goes on to say, artificial intelligence red teaming is most often performed by a dedicated red team that adopts adversarial methods to identify flaws and vulnerabilities, such as harmful and discriminatory outputs of an AI system, unforeseen or undesirable system behaviors, limitations, and potential risks associated with the misuse of the system. So I think it is important to emphasize at the outset that red teaming should not be the sole focus nor a replacement for a more comprehensive program of risk identification, assessment, and management for generative AI. As the definition put forth by White House suggests, red teaming is one method for risk identification and assessment. There are additional methods and mechanisms for risk assessment, including audits and field testing, which again, Elham also mentioned, and these are often equally important, if not more so, to conduct. Additionally, red teaming on its own does not offer any methods or proposals to defend the system and mitigate risks. So it is important for it to be part of a larger risk management ecosystem. Okay, with the history and definitions out of the way, let's take a quick look at AI red teaming activities that have been recently conducted by the tech industry. So to capture the complexity involved in the red teaming of generative AI in practice, I am going to tell you about our synthesis, our takeaways from the 6 red teaming activities conducted by the companies that you see on this slide. And in fact, one of the suggestions proposed to NIST by industry players was to collect case studies, illustrations, and examples of red teaming activities to exemplify best practices and state of the art. You can think about us having taken a step in that direction, although I should note that our analysis is based on publicly available resources, so it is limited on certain fronts. So without delving too much into the detail, let me summarize our takeaways for you, having read all the reports that have been made available about recent red teaming activities conducted by industry players. So first of all, large language models have been the primary object of red teaming evaluations. Most red teaming activities in the 6 or 7 case studies we analyzed focused on large language models, with only 2 focusing on multimodal generative AI models. The target vulnerabilities were very broad and they ranged from highly specific objectives, for example, the red teaming to investigate risks to national security specifically, to more broad targets such as uncovering harmful model behavior. And red teaming were, in the case studies we looked at, red teaming efforts were usually focused on probing broad threat models, such as producing harmful or offensive model outputs. And it appears that the intention behind that is to provide red team members with a broader scope of the kinds of vulnerabilities and risks that they can identify through the event, through the activity, but it is often given the very large risk surface for generative AI models, this can cause some difficulty in covering a good range of the risk space, and it ends up with the red teamers probing non-specific threat models. Potentially, they might be incentivized to go with those that are easier to identify. So that's one observation that we made. So in some cases, red teaming was conducted by internal teams prior to model release, while in other cases, red teaming was conducted on publicly released models through APIs and by external non-expert members. So team compositions varied quite a bit across different red teaming activities, and the resources available to the evaluation team also seem to vary based on the nature of the members of the red team, and the resources such as time and compute were available to them depending on the task and whether they were internal or external. So for teams with subject matter expertise, red teaming efforts we observed were more open-ended, and there were fewer strict restrictions on time and compute power, to give you a little bit more detail. Red teaming activities conducted so far vary considerably in the processes they follow and in the methods that they allow red team members to follow. Some organizations, for instance, chose to conduct a single round of red teaming, while others saw red teaming as an iterative process in which results from initial rounds of red teaming testing were utilized to prioritize risk areas and do further investigations. We also found significant variation in the publicly shared outputs of red teaming efforts. In some cases, specific examples of risky and harmful model behavior uncovered by red teaming was publicly released. In other cases, especially those that focused on national security, specifics of harmful behavior were not publicly disclosed, with the justification that the findings were too sensitive. And finally, the specifics of risk mitigation strategies were often not provided and evaluated. We evaluated similar takeaways through an extensive survey of recent research on AI red teaming, and we observed the prevalence of ad hoc methods to specify the target vulnerability and risks. This idea that something is a risk or a harm, you will know it when you see it, as opposed to first specifying what the threat model is and what is the specific vulnerability that red teamers should try to capture. We also observed that there is a wide range of methods that have been proposed by the research community to perform red teaming. Many of those are focused on automating the process of red teaming, sometimes partially and sometimes completely, fully automating the process. We came up with a high-level categorization of the numerous recent methodologies that have been proposed by the recent literature. Some of these methods utilize brute force approaches involving manual evaluation of generative AI inputs and outputs by teams of humans. Most of the time, researchers and academics are the people conducting this. Other methods involve having AI models generate test cases and find errors in other AI outputs. For example, one of the common ways that there has been efforts to generate jailbreak prompts by large language models is to ask the model itself to generate a prompt that would get around some of the safeguards in place. There are also algorithmic processes to search for prompts that would allow for the defenses to be broken. This includes starting from some prompt, modifying and perturbing it until it gets us the desired output, which is breaking some of the safety features that are baked into these models. So our analysis that I just outlined for you here revealed a glaring lack of consensus around the scope, structure, and assessment criteria for AI red teaming exercises. So we decided to utilize these observations to propose a set of essential criteria and considerations that we thought should be part of any effective AI red teaming guideline. And we break these criteria into those that needs to be considered pre-activity when we are at the stage of planning the red teaming activity, those that need to happen during the activity, and those that need to happen post-activity. So starting with our pre-activity criteria, an important question that we need to start from is what is the artifact under evaluation through the proposed red teaming activity? For instance, is it the generative AI model in isolation, or is it the broader system in which it is going to be embedded when it is utilized for specific use cases? Many comments submitted to NIST emphasize that NIST should differentiate between AI model red teaming versus AI system red teaming. And this is something that we will come back to in some of our panels. Other questions that are important under this broader question of what is it that we are trying to red teaming is, for instance, what is the version of the model that is to be evaluated? What are the safety and security guardrails that are already in place for this artifact? At what stage of the AI lifecycle for this model the evaluation is going to be conducted? For example, is it pre or post deployment? Has the model been already released? And if so, what are the conditions of the release? Is there API access to the model or full access? The second question we need to think about carefully before starting a red teaming activity is what is the precise threat model that the red teaming activity aims to probe? This includes questions such as whether the activity is meant to illustrate a handful of possible vulnerabilities, whether the activity is meant to identify a broad range of potential vulnerabilities which are to be prioritized later on, or whether the activity is meant to assess the risk of a very specific vulnerability. For instance, whether we can get the model to produce the recipe for an explosive. The third question that's important to consider pre-activity is what is the specific vulnerability the red teaming activity aims to find? How was the vulnerability identified as the target of evaluation? Why was this particular vulnerability prioritized over all other possible vulnerabilities? Again, the risk surface is huge for general purpose models such as large language models, so it's important to specify why are we prioritizing the specific vulnerabilities, and it's important to understand what is the threshold of acceptable risk for finding this vulnerability. This goes back to the question of baseline of comparison for whether we consider a behavior a risk that we need to do something about. The fourth question is, what are the criteria for assessing the success of the red teaming activity? In particular, what are the benchmarks of comparison, and whether the activity can be reconstructed and reproduced. Team composition is another very important topic that we are going to come back to in our panel discussions. It is important to specify what is the criteria for inclusion and exclusion of members in the team and why. It is important to understand that there are differences between members who are experts versus non-experts and members who are external to the organization conducting the red teaming and members who are not external. One large tech company emphasized that NIST should be flexible in their guidelines around red teaming and cautioned against the feasibility of engaging external experts due to technical feasibility limitations. And I assume that refers to proprietary nature of some of these models. Okay, and moving on to the within activity criteria for red teaming, it is important to clarify what are the resources available to participants and whether it realistically mirrors that of a potential adversary. This goes back to one of the questions raised by the audience about the importance of understanding that adversarial attacks against these models may not be as common as red teaming activities may suggest on the surface. Speaking of resources, two important considerations are the time available and the compute power available. It is also important to understand that the kinds of instructions instructions provided to the participants to guide the activity is going to have huge impacts on how the activity goes. This is ultimately a human activity, and we know that with those kinds of activity, there is always the priming effect, framing effect, and so on and so forth. The kinds of access that participants get can have a huge impact on the kinds of results that we get, and it is important to clarify what are the methods that the members of the team could utilize to test the artifact. And as I mentioned before, there have been proposals for using a combination of AI and humans to do red teaming activities. Okay, post-activity criteria, one of the most important criteria to consider is reporting and documentation. We currently don't have standards around. In the reports that we look at, there were huge variability in the type of information that was released publicly. It is important to clarify what needs to be produced at the end of the red teaming activity, who should have access, and if access is limited, why. It is important to clarify the resources that were utilized for the successful conclusion of the red teaming activity and justify whether those resources were actually necessary, especially when these activities become very expensive. There is the concern that they may be utilized as a mechanism to keep smaller players out of properly evaluating their model. So it's important to clarify why certain resources were necessary for the red teaming activity to be successful. We need to, after the red teaming activity is done, we need to assess whether it was successful according to the criteria we specified prior to the activity. And ultimately, it is important, it is very crucial for red teaming activity to be followed by a blue teaming activity, proposing measures to mitigate the risks identified. In particular, how will the efficacy of the mitigation strategy be evaluated? Who will be in charge of doing the mitigation? And what are some mechanisms for accountability? These are some important criteria to consider post the activity. Okay, so we offered around a dozen critical first-order criteria that we believe must be specified and justified for an effective red teaming activity. Let's now do a quick overview of the event today. So the goal of today's event is to critique and expand on these existing guidelines for AI red teaming, with the goal of supporting NIST's effort to produce guidelines for AI red teaming as mandated by the EO, and it is due early in the summer, so it's upcoming. So we hope that the content produced today by our expert panelists and the audience here can illuminate fruitful research directions, shed light on areas of improvement in existing practice around red teaming, and inform future policymaking initiatives around AI safety evaluations. We are proud to be one of the founding members of the consortium of the US AI Safety Institutes, and we will share the outputs of this event with NIST and also in a publicly available format of a white paper. So keep an eye out for that. And also, as audience in this in the room today, you will contribute to the conversation. So please treat your participation in the discussions as a way of serving the public and contributing to the guidelines that are in production. So in line with the three-pronged focus on research, practice, and policy of red teaming, the event today consists of 3 expert panels. The first panel which will be right after the break, if I let you go to the break, is going to be on 4 fronts of red teaming research. The second one is going to be on industry practices and red teaming. And the third one is going to be on legal and policy implications of red teaming. We are really thrilled to have an amazing lineup of experts from industry, government, and academia joining us today to discuss this timely topic. And we are also proud to showcase the depth and rigor of CMU's work in this space of safety evaluations for AI, both through our panelists and also through the lightning talks we are going to have during lunch. So we will do a more at-length introduction to our panelists, but I just want to end by mentioning that some of the key topics that we are going to discuss in our panels are as follows. So in panel 1, which is focused on research, we are going to talk about the precise definition of red teaming, when it is applicable and when it is not, what are some of the existing measures of success, and what are the gaps in existing research around red teaming. Panel 2, which is focused on practice in industry, is going to address topics such as comparison with cybersecurity practices, practical choices surrounding the object of evaluation, threat models, resources, team compositions, and so on. And we are also going to address issues of open sourcing. And last but not least, in the policy discussion we are going to have later today, we are going to talk about the definition, the legal definition of what it means for a model to be dual use. This was the term utilized by the EO, and how we can determine different risk tiers that may warrant different types of evaluations. We are going to talk about how policymakers can ensure some kind of a consistency between domain-specific regulations and regulations more broadly applicable to AI. And we are going to talk about the challenges of top-down versus bottom-up approaches to AI governance. So with that, I would like to finish my remarks. Apologies for taking a couple minutes more than originally expected. Here are some of the resources that are utilized in this talk. I very much look forward to the conversation we are going to have today. And I am finally letting you go for the break. Thank you.